Welcome to Healthy Mind Science, a show dedicated to translating youth and young adult mental health research into the real world. We have conversations with experts in psychology, neuroscience, human development, computer science, education, and more, with a focus on helping parents and educators take research findings into their everyday lives and ultimately better support our young people. Healthy Mind Science is an affiliate of the Center for Healthy Mind and Mood, which is an interdisciplinary research center at University of Colorado Boulder, and we're on a mission to increase emotional resilience and end youth depression. I'm your host, Alicia. Let's get started. All right. Well, today we have Amelia Moser on, and I'm so excited because both your study and just you are brilliant. And so I'm really excited to have a conversation with you about your work. Amelia is a sixth-year PhD student in clinical psychology and neuroscience. And yeah, let's just go ahead and dive in. Amelia, thank you so much for being on the show. First off, why don't you just tell us just a bit about yourself?
Yeah, thanks so much for having me. I'm excited to be here. Like you said, I'm a student in clinical psychology and neuroscience, and I get really excited when I have opportunities to talk about research. So I'm
Yeah.
excited to dive in.
Well, let's dive into what your research interests are. So, what is your area of research right now?
I'm especially interested in predicting mood disorders for adolescents and young adults. So, trying to understand what factors are going to contribute most to who develops a mood disorder and why to help inform preventative work. And then I'm also interested in what changes in the brain when people with mood disorders like depression get better. And are there more efficient ways to facilitate that? Are there new treatments we can come up with based on that information?
Yeah, that's super interesting. So how did you get involved or just interested in this type of work?
When I was an undergrad, I mean, mental health problems are kind of everywhere. And so, especially in college students have a really hard time. And so I think it was just really apparent to me that this was a really big problem. And I took a bunch of classes as an undergrad that were really interesting to me about kind of the biological bases of mood disorders and kind of what happens in the body when people develop things like depression. Um, and I specifically remember a class where I learned that common medications like Prozac that are really commonly prescribed, there's only a limited understanding of why they work. They work pretty well, but we only have a limited understanding of why. And that really surprised me as an undergrad, and kind of made me really excited to try to research who do these medications work for? Why do they work for them? Are there ways to make them better?
So now you're gonna just devote your life to figuring that out.
That's that's the idea. There's a lot to know. It's like that's I think of it as like the ocean, like the great ocean where like there's just an enormous amount that we don't yet know.
Yeah. I think I was surprised too, kind of very early stage getting into this work. Like, wow, we don't know a lot about it. And, you talked about specifically the Prozac and, that's one treatment for one medication treatment, right, for depression. And so there's so many layers to even just get to that particular, number one, getting diagnosed, right? So just the access and also getting it at the right time when you need it is really difficult, but then it may or may not work for you. And so so that's just one right example, even though that one is the most effective as far as medication wise. Yeah, so it's just really interesting to hear that, and also there's again so much to learn as well.
Absolutely.
So maybe we can go ahead and dive into the study that you worked on that we are talking about today, which is called Self-Guided Mindfulness Reduces College Student Anxiety, a scalable pre-registered pilot study. So I'd love to maybe just get started on why you were sort of interested in this type of study.
Yeah, I think our lab was really interested in kind of the impact of stress on mental health problems because we know stress makes almost every mental health problem worse, right? Stress often precedes mood disorders like depression. It can make anxiety worse. It can make lots of things just harder. And we sort of viewed the COVID pandemic as a really big kind of mass stressor, right? Especially for college students where classes were suddenly moved online. A lot of them were sent home. So they had to move. They maybe lost a job or family members were sick. It was an enormous time of enormous stress, I should say. And so we wanted to understand, are there kind of relatively basic wellness strategies that college students can use to buffer the effects of that major stressor and kind of um, help them be resilient in the face of this kind of major change. So that's kind of where this study came from.
Love that. And one of the things that I just want to kind of pinpoint, just even from the title, it's a scalable pre-registered study. What does that mean from a researcher lens to like the everyday person who maybe not doesn't know that language?
Absolutely. So the pre-registered part means we did science the way you're supposed to. We picked the hypotheses ahead of time and we laid out, this is what we think is going to happen before we look at any of the data. This is what we expect. And we put that on an open science website so that other researchers have a record of what our plan was. And then we did the analyses and did all the things we said we were going to do and published. And it's a way of kind of being more responsible in science, just to hold ourselves all accountable that we're doing exactly the science we said we were going to do. And we're not doing kind of extra tests afterwards to try to get the finding we wanted and things like that. The scalable part is one of the most exciting parts of this study to me is these were really low level interventions, really simple interventions. Some studies use great, really complicated, expensive interventions, and those can be really powerful. The goal of this one was, is there little things we can do that have a sizable impact on college student mental health? And so the scalable piece just means it's easily disseminable. We can kind of scale it in a broad way across a college campus or across kind of broader populations.
Yeah, for sure. I love it. Awesome. Well, let's dive into the actual study design. And I guess maybe before we dive into that, I think in the intro, you really laid out beautifully how prevalent anxiety is among college students specifically. I didn't know if you wanted to add anything related to that at all, but it just like I see it, I feel it on college campuses. We see it in so many different types of data that's being collected just from like survey reports all the way to, rigorous research. But yeah, I don't know if you have anything else to add to
Yeah.
that, but
I think it's just important to note that it's really prevalent and it's increasing, especially anxiety has been increasing in college students even before the COVID pandemic was pretty steadily increasing. And then of course COVID seems to have made things worse and for people because it was a really hard time. And I think that's important for people to know in terms of resources. So college students need as much support as possible because of that. And I think it's really important from more of a stigma perspective that this is something, if you're experiencing it, a lot of your classmates are experiencing it too. And even though it might feel like you're alone in it, you're not.
that's a really, really good point. Thank you for sharing that. Well, let's dive into the study design and what you were trying to understand.
Absolutely. This study started at the very beginning of the COVID pandemic, like March 2020, very beginning. They worked really hard to kind of get it rolling right away, which is exciting. And they recruited 300 college students at the University of Colorado Boulder and randomly assigned them to one of three groups. So we designed a one wellness group based on mindfulness, one wellness group based on behavioral activation, which is a treatment for depression based on positive activity scheduling, and then one control group where they just filled out surveys to help us differentiate the effect of filling out surveys over time and tracking mood from kind of these intentional wellness groups. So everyone was assigned one of those groups and asked the people in the wellness groups were asked to do one wellness activity per day. So for example, the mindfulness group was asked to do one mindfulness activity per day. The behavioral activation group was asked to do one kind of positive activating activity per day. And we followed them for a couple months and tracked kind of their mood progression, their anxiety progression, just saw how things kind of continued to develop over time.
Yeah. So, how did you decide on the anxiety? And I think you looked at intolerance of uncertainty. So, I want to dive into both of maybe the measures that you used and how you were trying to conceptualize those.
Absolutely. So I think intolerance of uncertainty is just a really interesting idea and kind of variable to be using in research. Intolerance of uncertainty is this idea that the unknown or having incomplete information is distressing. And so there's folks for whom having something be unknown, having some sort of incomplete information is really upsetting and really worrisome, and really kind of gets in the way. And that can even, it's not even just uncertainty about kind of upcoming negative things like fear. So it's different from anxiety in the sense that it might be you're distressed by uncertainty about a positive thing. Like if I told you you might win the lottery tomorrow, that would be like, might be inherently really distressing because it's the not knowing that's so upsetting. And I think COVID came with so much uncertainty. There was so much you didn't know about what was going to happen, who might get sick, what was going to happen with school or work. And so there were scientists creating these kind of models of anxiety and mental health problems specific to the COVID pandemic that really centered uncertainty and kind of how people interpret uncertainty. And so I thought that would be a really interesting place to go with these data and try to see in our particular sample, did these wellness groups move the needle on anxiety over time for folks? And did intolerance of uncertainty change during that time, or did that play a role in any way?
Yeah. I think that just the construct is really interesting. And in my own life, probably in your own life, I don't know, like, it is uncomfortable, right? To not know
Absolutely.
some things.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, different layers of stress, it can cause stress in different people and different ways. But, so I think it's just a really unique measure, and, so I was excited to see that in the study. Um, cool. Well, I think, maybe next we can dive into, like, what did you think would happen? Like, what were the
Oh,
hypotheses
yeah.
that you were sort of trying to test?
So broadly, I thought that the wellness groups would show. So everyone started out relatively anxious, just because this was the very beginning of the COVID pandemic. So, like on average, anxiety was a bit elevated. And broadly, I expected folks in the wellness groups to show a steeper decline in anxiety, so a bigger improvement in anxiety over time, relative to our control group who were just filling out surveys. And then more specifically, I thought that folks who started out with really high intolerance of uncertainty might benefit the most from the wellness groups. Like maybe if I have really high intolerance of uncertainty, uncertainty is really distressing, maybe a daily mindfulness practice would be even more powerful for me for reducing my anxiety. And I thought that intolerance of uncertainty might change over time. So as my anxiety got better, maybe my reduced intolerance of uncertainty might help explain that change in anxiety.
Yeah. Yeah, that's really cool. Are there this is a side sort of like question. Are there, interventions to support intolerance of certain uncertainty, like to improve? Is there data to show that like mindfulness or wellness activities or behavioral activation supports that, or is that still pretty early on in the research?
So I would say it's both. So it's relatively early on, and there is some emerging evidence, especially around mindfulness, that mindfulness might be able to improve intolerance of uncertainty. There's less overall data about behavioral activation. Classically, is a treatment for depression. There's some evidence of it for anxiety and a little bit for intolerance of uncertainty, um, but mindfulness is more directly thought to target that. And so actually in our hypotheses, we did specifically think that mindfulness would have the biggest kind of positive effect on those variables relative to the behavioral activation based group.
So you looked at these 3 groups. What happened? What happened over time? What did you notice?
Yeah. So everyone got a bit better over time. I think probably, which I attribute to kind of adjusting to the pandemic. Because if you recall, we started in March 2020 and we followed them for a few months. And so everyone showed a little bit of an improvement in anxiety across the whole sample. But really importantly, people in the mindfulness group showed the steepest improvement. So they showed kind of the biggest sort of benefit or biggest change in anxiety specifically, relative to the control group who were just filling out surveys, and even relative to the group that was doing a positive activity each day. Interestingly, intolerance of uncertainty wasn't related. So folks who started out highly intolerant of uncertainty showed basically the same response to the wellness groups as everyone else. And intolerance of uncertainty did not explain the change in anxiety. So there's some other mechanism that's kind of at play, which I think is kind of interesting.
Yeah, that sounds really fun to continue to explore.
But yeah, absolutely.
Well, I think it just for folks who are listening, who are educators or parents working with young people, or educators who work with young people, like, I think we can talk a little bit about what those mindfulness practices are just at a very high level, and then compare that to kind of the positive activities that were kind of underlying the behavioral activation.
Mhm,
Um, because what I think I remember reading is that the mindfulness practices were specifically like were much higher, higher significance. There was a higher change that was significantly different from the other two groups, and I found that really interesting because so for the mindfulness practices, it's grounding body, so grounding your body, and there's directions on how to do that for the young person who was in the study. Compassion, attention to emotions, walking meditation, and stress visualization. And then there were other ones that you could choose, which I loved that was part of the study where it was really guiding the young person to pick one that feels doable, that also feels like it's connected to something that, or like what they kind of aligns with them. I loved
mhm,
that was part of the study design. So that was sort of the mindfulness group. So they had
mhm,
those 5 options plus the one that they could just choose that's related to mindfulness. And so I found that that was really, really powerful because these can take 5 minutes, 10 minutes, like doesn't have to be this enormous intervention. And I think that's what you alluded to in the beginning of like, this is fairly a small intervention. And so how do we integrate this longer, in longer term in college settings? But that's another question for another day. But I
That's a
found
whole
that that
other
was
problem. Yeah.
right, exactly. So that's sort of like that group one that had the significant difference and then or this, like a higher level of change in anxiety because of these participating in these activities. And then this the second tier was the positive activities that were related to behavioral activation. And what I love about these is that they're also very simple. So I'll just list a few examples. One is listening to a podcast, being outdoors, going for a walk or a run or a hike, singing around the house, taking a drive, spending time with family, um, stargazing, reading a book, having a lunch, making a gratitude list. These are all really helpful for our self-care, for our daily well-being, but those didn't necessarily move the needle, it sounds like, as much. Is that kind of what I'm understanding? Yeah. I thought that that was really interesting, and then, of course, the control group didn't get either of these activities, and, which I love that you all had that in the design because that obviously makes the findings even more powerful.
Absolutely, yeah.
What else do you feel like you learned from the study?
I think mostly I was honest. I mean, we had our hypotheses going in and they were authentic hypotheses. And at the same time, I was genuinely a little bit pleasantly surprised that people benefited from the wellness groups. Because just to your point, these are such relatively small changes that we asked people to make and can be relatively easily integrated into daily life. And so I wasn't really sure if we were going to see anything, you know?
And I
Especially things being so stressful during COVID, like, can this little change really make an impact? I don't know. I think it was really encouraging to see that even small changes can make a big difference. So I think that's kind of one of the biggest things that I take from this.
Yeah, it's so true. And this was, I think it was asked for daily, and then you all asked if they like were planning to do it or something. Is that right?
Yeah, there was a planning component because there's research that if you make a plan for doing something the next day, you're more likely to. So maybe you might get hassled around like November elections. You might get hassled by pollsters calling and asking for your voting plan. And it's because there's research that if you make a plan for when you're going to vote, you're more likely to. And the same is true for behavioral interventions in psychology. If you make a plan for, I'm going to do this activity tomorrow, you're much more likely to do it. Or I'm going to do this mindfulness practice tomorrow. And so that was a way of trying to um, boost people's kind of likelihood to engage with the practices and reduce barriers.
And it looks like then you tracked if they actually did it as well, right?
Exactly.
You asked them in those daily surveys. So
Yep.
I think that that is really super helpful too, because you could have just not tracked it and just assumed that folks were. And so it's not just the treatment control or two different treatments in control group. It's really like, did they actually follow through with what the intervention was supposed to be?
Exactly.
So I
And
think that that
there was a relationship between number of days where they did the activity and
mm,
improvement. So people who engaged more and had more frequent days where they really remembered to do it had kind of the best bang for their buck. They had kind of the best outcomes in terms of reduced anxiety, which I think is also kind of promising because that's what you would want to see if this is kind of offering some help. You would want there to be improvement with more consistent engagement.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I think it's such a cool study. So what do you feel like are the practical implications? What do you want parents and educators to know about the study?
I think the biggest thing is that introducing even brief mindfulness exercises uh, can help improve mental health, at least a little bit. And, this is not kind of a one stop shop where you should just do 5 minutes of mindfulness and do nothing else for your mental health and you'll be great, right? The idea is that this is part of kind of a suite or a toolkit of practices you can use to improve mental health. Um, and at the same time, it's a relatively easy one that you can do from anywhere. You don't need any special materials for. It could be as simple as starting your day with mindfully eating breakfast and really focusing on specific things about like the texture of your cereal or the color of something of your apple that day or something like that. And so I think, and you raised this earlier, one of the benefits of this study was that people were able to pick the practices they most wanted to do that best aligned with their life. And that's what's going to happen out in the real world is people are going to do what works for them. And our study was able to show that even with that really wide range of different practices people might do, there was still some overall benefit. Um, so I think that's, for me, that's the biggest take home is that integrating even brief daily mindfulness activities can improve mental health and can be an additional tool in our toolkit.
Yeah, I think it's such a interesting again intervention or tool that is so simple, but so it almost feels like there's no way that it can be this helpful to us, but it is, and it's been shown in other studies as well, not just in this specific study. So I think that that means that there's a lot of evidence to say, right, that we should be looking at this more and practicing it more and teaching our young people, especially because the benefits are obviously lifelong. If they can learn this as a teenager, going through lots of changes, lots of stress, lots of uncertainty, lots of feelings of anxiety and depression, if they have this toolkit early, they're able to use it and leverage it more often. I think the other thing too that stood out to me, one of the things that I was talking about with Dr. Rosie Kaiser on a previous episode, but then also just in our work, was that one of the biggest challenges to even just therapy is that you kind of are working through things during therapy and, you're trying to encourage the client or the patient to actually practice strategies in the real world. And it's really hard to make that transition to get folks to make those changes in the
Absolutely.
real world. And so, like you were saying, like these are very simple that you can kind of take and do what works for you. But it's really, we don't know and young people don't know what works for them yet, maybe because they've
Exactly.
never practiced this. So really offering different ones and having them actually try them out because I know I was so skeptical at first with mindfulness, meditation, and trying different things. And when I do it, I do feel better, but it's hard to integrate that into your daily life. So,
Absolutely. And it can be hard to start out with because I mean, it's especially if you're feeling more stressed or activated, it can be hard to kind of, even the thought of sitting still for a second might sound really unpleasant or might kind of be like, I'm too busy, like I can't do that right now. And so I think even the practice of kind of getting settled in for a minute of mindfulness, I think can be useful as a starting point. Uh,
just like practically for educators and parents, is practicing this with the young people, right? So not just asking them to do it or teaching them how, but showing them how and practicing it alongside them. I think one of the things that I've noticed just raising a very, very little kid is just they observe everything. And I know that our young people do too, based on other conversations that we've had with young people. Like, they tell us stories about things that I know that their parents don't realize that they see, you know? It's so interesting. And so, if we can, like, practice it alongside it, "Hey, we're gonna try this new thing together," and then we
exactly.
can debrief and talk about it, and I had a colleague who was a professor in, I wanna say it was anthropology. It was something that was a little bit different than what I would think mindfulness, but he ended up practicing mindfulness in his class and, doing it in the first 5 minutes of class. every class or like once a week or something like that. And he just saw the engagement and it was so different in his classroom and just could see
Mhm.
the almost immediate impact that it had on college students. And so I think that's
Yep,
also something that, especially from educator perspective, to try and see if it works, right? And it may not for your
absolutely.
class, but it's something to potentially incorporate.
Absolutely. I was in a class that did that, and I thought it was really cool. It was like in the middle of a long lecture, they would pause and have a mindful minute, and no one was allowed to look on their phone or like, because if you tell college students we're gonna pause for a minute, everyone's gonna get their phones out or
That's
something.
check.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, there were, like, rules about, like, you couldn't talk to your neighbor, you couldn't look at your phone, everyone had to kinda just sit quietly for a minute, um, and it was really powerful, and there was definitely it felt like there was more I mean, anecdotally, it felt like there was more energy in the classroom afterwards, so I think things like that can just be and again, that took up, what, a minute of the lecture time? Like, these are really small changes.
Yeah. The other thing that stood out to me too was that it was sort of, again, prompted for the young person because I know there's sometimes even when I was working with young people, they'd be super excited about something. They're like, yes, I want to make this change. I'm going to go study right now, and they're really hyped up. They study that day, but then the next day comes and they just don't have the same kind of energy around it, or sometimes they forget because it's not part of the routine or whatever it is, like whatever they had committed to, they sort of forget. And so we know that there's strategies like writing it down, scheduling it in, those types of things. But I think one of the things that I loved about this study was that it prompted the
Mm,
person to sort of
yep,
like remember, like, oh, hey, what strategy are you going to use? And then again, the plan. I mean, I just think that like all of that, and then asking about it after, right? It knew that it was going to like ask if you did it or not. And I think that it's like the accountability piece, the plan, and then the nudge. I think that those three components were also super powerful. And I don't want to overlook those because those might be needed in the day to day, at least
totally.
to form like a habit.
Exactly, and I think that's a really important point because there's still pieces like you said, it can be really hard for college students to integrate these practices really consistently, and it takes time to build new habits. And we're still sorting out what are the key ingredients to go into integrating this into daily life. And I think you're exactly right. I think things like scheduling it out and that accountability piece are really big. And just finding are there ways for us to set that up in a real world context when you're not in a study?
And I think I've talked to a lot of college administrators who work in health and wellness and work in, yeah, either like the prevention or like health promotions and in those types of roles. And they are seeking, different ways to scale specifically interventions that are going to actually help young people that are affordable or free. And again, easy to use, easy to support young people. So I think there's definitely something here that we can leverage and build upon, I think, in the future. So just such a cool study. Anything else that you have in your mind that you wanted to share about the study?
Good question. I guess you brought up the examples of the different practices, and it reminded me of it reflects a lot of what you could put on like a brochure in like a campus counseling center or something like that, just in a waiting room or something. And so I like this idea that we can give people kind of menus to choose from, to choose their own what's going to work for them from. Like these things are evidence based. Can you find something amongst these items that might be useful for you to be able to integrate? And I think that's one of the pieces that might hopefully help us boost kind of uptake is having more agency over what they're deciding to do.
I just had this like vision, like practically, of like if somebody didn't know how to do this, like, so they see a brochure or something, but so you it's almost like in high anxiety times that we know and during midterms or towards the end of the semester when, anxiety is sort of elevated because there's a lot of stress happening from the academic side at least. And we know there's lots of stressors outside of academics too, but that's one we can have a little bit more prediction around. But having this like tent that is like all blocked off and it's like, want to feel better? Come in here
Uh-huh.
for a minute, sit in like a dark like
I
room.
love this.
You set the timer and
Yeah,
then it's like, just breathe and like center yourself, right? And then you just have like a line of like people wanting to go in and like you feel better on the way out. I don't know. Like
that's
that's something
awesome. I love
stupid
that.
and simple, but like just to sort of like expose people to this type of activity. I don't know.
Absolutely. No,
But
absolutely. Well, and because people have really different ideas of what mindfulness is, right? Like sometimes people picture like week-long silent retreats as being kind of the only thing that mindfulness is. And the reality is mindfulness is anytime you're being kind of aware on purpose, non-judgmentally, right? Anytime you're kind of just allowing things to be on purpose, that counts as being mindful. So maybe you're being mindful when you look at a cloud, or maybe you're being mindful when you eat a cracker, or maybe you're being mindful when you sit and count breaths for a couple breaths. There's a lot of ways to be mindful.
Well, any other exciting projects that you're working on right now that you want to share?
Sure. I mean, so we have a lot. The lab has a ton of research going on, which is just a really exciting time.
And
One
you're
of the
involved in all of them, I feel like. So
I am involved in a lot of projects. I get very excited about research, and so there's always time to add on another one. One of the projects I'm working on is we were curious about other interventions, alongside things like mindfulness and behavioral activation that could help with mood disorders like depression. And so we had a pilot study where we looked at whether cannabidiol or CBD, which is a non-intoxicating cannabinoid in cannabis or hemp. And we were curious. There's lots of people that are using CBD for all kinds of things, and there's almost no research for or against its effectiveness. And there's lots of people using it specifically for depression. And so we did a pilot study where we recruited folks and had them who were interested in trying CBD for depression. And we followed them over time and did a bunch of different tasks and surveys and brain scans. And so I'm just starting to dig into data from that study. So I'm really excited to see what we find.
but we will definitely bring you on to talk about that next because that sounds really exciting. Awesome. Any other advice or thoughts that you want to leave with parents or educators who work with young people around depression, anxiety?
Your point about modeling behaviors is really well taken and really important. And that these are practices that we should be doing ourselves, So, and kind of putting our money where our mouth is and doing the things that will help our own mental health and help kids' mental health, and making sure we're kind of being consistent, and that is one of the best ways to kind of disseminate these interventions is by modeling it for other people and practicing it consistently.
Thank you so much for being on the show. We really appreciate you and can't wait to follow your research.
Yeah, thank you so much.